it's my great pleasure now to introduce Peter. So Peter is a professor of education in the School of Education, and Peter's research focuses on young people, their education, training and employment pathways, and their health and planetary well-being at a time of profound planetary crises at the convergence of the sixth mass extinction and the fourth industrial revolution. And Peter's been working on the Young People Sustainability's Future Lab and leads that. And that's I think I'm sure that Peter's going to be speaking about that a bit more later. So I'll pass over to Peter. And just before everyone is worried, I don't think Peter's going to be sharing a PowerPoint as such, but there will be links, and I'm going to download the document and make sure that everyone has those links, and I'll put that in the chat in a bit. But over to you, Peter. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eve. Thanks for the acknowledgement of country, and thanks everyone for taking time out of their busy days today to come along to this or to watch it online at some point. As Eve said, I've sent through a Word document that has basically most of the text of the presentation and some links to some of the resources that I want to share, and I just thought that would save people taking lots of notes and be able to make reference to the document after the presentation. My interest today, not so much with outlining particular methodologies or with discussing particular methods. Rather, I'm much more interested in thinking about research as a process of institutionalized intellectual knowledge production that for most of us is undertaken in the neoliberal university. In that sense, it is a particular, often limited process of knowledge production that takes place in institutionalized spaces, which can be understood and examined as a labour process that is shaped by and governed by an array of often competing forces and by work practices that emerge from and shape that labour process. As well as being far from original, and I own up to this not being original, my concerns today are also much more than an old man shouting at clouds. I've been doing this sort of work for the last 25 years, starting with my PhD thesis. And in this work, I've argued as a sociologist of young people, education, training and work, that youth as a category, as a population, can be understood as an artifact of institutionalized intellectual expertise. An artifact that is constructed at the intersection of governmentalized, that is, rationalized, institutionalized and abstracted representations of things such as crime, education, family, the media, popular culture. How we imagine these intersections produces our understandings of youth. As Foucault might say, none of this is inherently bad, but it may be dangerous. So I've been thinking for quite some time about the limits and possibilities of these processes of knowledge production and the methodologies that shape them at what Bradotti calls the convergence of the fourth industrial revolution and the sixth mass extinction, between what she calls an advanced knowledge economy, which perpetuates patterns of discrimination and exclusion, and the threat of climate change devastation for both human and non-humans. So today I want to draw on John Law's understandings of method assemblage, C. Wright Mill's concept of a sociological imagination, and a number of recent pandemic era projects with young people to suggest that we need to radically reimagine a sociological imagination for the Anthropocene against the backdrop of what Cory Doctorow has called the enshittification of public life and what that will mean for demands for social climate and intergenerational justice. And if you haven't heard of that concept, Macquarie Dictionary's word of the year in 2024, enshittification briefly and in part is marked both by a loss of respect for or trust in expertise, and by the mantra that when confronted with questions about whether the earth is flat or whether vaccines are a mechanism for Bill Gates and his co-conspirators to implant microchips in the population to control them, or whether, as Q suggests, we are ruled by a cabal of pedophilic Satanists, then we should all do our own research. But first, before I get into that, a quick introduction to a number of projects that we have undertaken in the last couple of years, and I'll share my screen for this. And I just want to briefly, as I said, the links to this part of the presentation are in the document that I've shared. So the Young People Sustainable Futures Lab, as colleagues and myself, Imagine it as a collaborative research lab for co-designing young people's sustainable futures in times of crisis and disruption. I need to move this out of my way to get to the next tab. Okay, cool. Project I want to spend most time on at the moment is a project we undertook in 2020 and 2021 in the midst of the pandemic. It was titled COVID-19 Recovery Scenarios for Young People in Melbourne's Inner North. And in partnership with the Inner North Local Learning Employment Network and their stakeholders, we designed a project that would interview young people using a video capture technology called Video Ask that enabled asynchronous video interviews with young people responding to video questions that we asked. A series of video interviews that the LEN constructed with their own stakeholders, including in the Inner North, but also national peak bodies. And the aim of that scenario planning project was to develop a series of stories about possible futures. And in some respects, this was a methodology that was quite foreign to sociology of young people, quite foreign to social science itself. The idea that you could use data gathered from interviews with young people, with stakeholders, and various research reports that were being published at that time about COVID itself, but the climate crisis, crisis of capitalism. What sort of futures could young people imagine for themselves if we named 2025 as a point of reference in 2020? Again, on this webpage, there's a copy of the report and the full report. There's a number of more academic publications that we published in relation to that. There's a series of project videos that we've uploaded featuring young people's thoughts about both that time in their life and what they imagine the future might look like. And what we constructed was a series of 3 stories, and we called the first scenario Chaotic Futures, the future we want to avoid. Second story about possible futures was called Unsustainable Futures, the future we are likely to get, and Sustainable Futures, the future we hope for. And again, these stories weren't predictions for what the world would look like in 2025. Scenario planning as a methodology isn't about predictions. It's about telling stories about possible futures by including a whole variety of uncertainties as well as a whole variety of data sources in that respect. So if you're interested in that project, I'm happy to maybe discuss it a bit at the end or to talk about it at some other time. The other project that I want to outline at this point is a project that followed on from that, again, using the same video capture technology, young people's education and employment aspirations, again, in the immediate aftermath, actually started during still the pandemic and pandemic lockdowns in 21, and then following a group of young people through 22 and 23 and the start of 24. Again, a number of resources developed out of that, including a number of reports, but we also produced a mini documentary from those videos that young people provided us with during those 3 years. Thinking about how it is that you get young people to think about those futures, we had a very simple set of questions that we asked young people to respond to, including tell us a little bit about your life at the moment, tell us a little bit about how COVID's impacting your life, tell us what you think your life will be like in 2025, tell us what you think the planet will look like in 2025. And it opened up a space in which young people were able to curate their video responses to those questions. So again, trying to think about ways in which you can engage with young people in ways that are productive. And I'll come back to some of those in a little while. But first, I now want to move into what I've called elsewhere on the absurdity of the neoliberal university or the absurdity of doing youth studies, because I want to point to some of those challenges that I talked about. In early 2019, I published a blog on the Australian Sociological Association Youth Thematic Group blog. It was titled On the Absurdity of Youth Studies. The blog opened with an extract from John Sutherland's A Little History of Literature, in which he observed, and I quote, "The human condition for Kafka is well beyond tragic or depressed. It is absurd. He believed that the whole human race was the product of one of God's bad days. There is no meaning to make sense of our lives. Albert Camus' essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, pictures the human condition in the mythical figure Sisyphus, doomed for eternity to roll a rock up a hill, only for it to fall down again. Pointless. Only two responses are feasible in the face of man's Sisyphean fate: suicide or rebellion. In that blog, I opened with this extract to point to a significant philosophical and literary history that has raised some fundamental questions about the character and purpose and meaning of human existence. And in exploring some of the dimensions of these questions, various writers have concluded that much of human existence was indeed absurd. My intent was not to explore these various meanings of what absurd might mean, but to open a space in which I could flag some ways in which I thought that the governmentalised intellectual practice of youth studies in globalising, increasingly commodified knowledge spaces anchored in the contemporary neoliberal university was indeed absurd. In that context, I identified what I call 7 dimensions of the absurd. The first, youth studies, at least in the more orthodox versions of this academic field, invest heavily in the authenticity of young people, invest heavily in the authentic character of young people's experience of their lives and their understandings of their lives. Human lives lived and experienced in their inherent mystery, opacity, complexity, contradiction, ambivalence, pain and hurt, joy and pleasure. Second dimension, invest heavily in the authentic character of young people's voice. Invest heavily in young people's capabilities to think about, consider, rationalise, articulate their experience in all of its inherent mystery, opacity, etc. Third dimension, invest heavily in the capabilities of the youth studies researcher employing any number of the approved knowledge practices of a governmentalised social and behavioural science to provoke, incite, encourage, cajole and capture the authentic voice and experience of young people in a heavily choreographed, stage-managed and approved qualitative and or quantitative, structured, semi-structured, unstructured, empowering, participative, objective research encounter. Fourth dimension, invest heavily in the capability of the youth studies researcher to construct accounts of these encounters that render the authentic voice and experience of young people intelligible, analysable and translatable in ways that conform to the rules of the academic writing genre and to demands for quality and impact. Fifth dimension, invest heavily in the promise that these abstract, institutionalised and rationalised rendering of the authentic voices and experiences of young people will not only circulate and translate in network knowledge flows, but that in these network flows, key stakeholders will encounter these renderings and become more knowledgeable about the authentic voice and experience of young people in ways that are significant and innovative, that produce national benefit and contribute to the strategic priorities of diverse stakeholders. Sixth dimension, invest heavily in the promise that this quality, impact, significance, innovation and national benefit will transform the logics of a globalised neoliberal capitalism that seeks to make and remake the world in an endless cycle of production, extraction and destruction. The final dimension invests heavily in the promise that if many populations of young people's lives seem little changed by the last 40 years of a more impactful youth studies, then it is because we just need to develop better ways of identifying, capturing, analysing, interpreting, cataloguing, curating, circulating the authentic voices and experiences of young people. As I suggested, this is why youth studies is absurd, but don't let that stop us doing it. I understood then, and possibly have a greater awareness now, that many who might have read these 7 dimensions would likely be confronted, even offended by this way of referencing the practices that they might be heavily invested in and have strong identifications to, professionally, personally, intellectually and emotionally. In having this awareness, I followed this listing of the dimensions of the absurd with a number of notes. These notes were meant to do a number of things, including, if you like, qualifying the provocations I had made in a way that might have made me seem more reasonable. less of a smartass. The first of those notes. Youth studies is no less, no more absurd than any of the other social and behavioural sciences. It just happens to be the absurdity I trade in. And what might be of interest is whether or not you recognise in this characterisation of the absurd in what it is that you do. The second note. By an encounter with a long read in the Guardian newspaper, where at that time in 2019, where the absurdities of the academic publishing industry and game were laid bare by Stephen Bouranier in an article titled, "Is the Staggeringly Profitable Business of Scientific Publishing Bad for Science?" This is what he had to say in part. Scientists create work under their own direction, funded largely by governments, and give it to publishers for free. The publisher pays scientific editors who judge whether the work is worth publishing and check its grammar. But the bulk of the editorial burden, checking the scientific validity and evaluating the experiments, a process known as peer review, is done by working scientists on a volunteer basis. The publishers then sell the product back to government-funded institutional and university libraries to be read by scientists, who, in a collective sense, create the product in the first place. And finally, the absurd doesn't mean that we stop doing something because we recognise that there are absurd elements to the doing of it. Importantly, the recognition of its absurd character means that we should approach the doing of it, or reflect on, or review, or critique the doing of it by others with a less judgmental ethos. We should become both more modest and less sure about the doing of it and what the doing of it actually promises. My hope in revisiting these ideas today is that it can gesture towards concerns I have about the limits and possibilities of developing and practicing a sociological imagination for the Anthropocene if we recognise the ways in which these sociological processes of knowledge production are governmentalised in the neoliberal university. A related concern references the way in which the doing of sociology is more and more a practice and process governed by the particular quantifiable understandings of quality and impact. Being a sociologist in the neoliberal university is increasingly a numbers game that seeks to value and reward the sociology that we do via a series of metrics, often in order that the minutiae of hours and minutes spent in labour can be equitably captured in a spreadsheet. It starts from a fallacy that we work 36 hours or more in a week. We, and others play the game at the same time as we are aware of its absurdity. Here, my sense is that we should be alert to and wary of the ways in which processes of commodification, individualisation and responsibilisation characterise much of what takes place in the neoliberal university, and the work practices that are shaped and rewarded by the neoliberal university create increasing demands for us to sit in judgment on the work undertaken by our colleagues. And many of us are found wanting in how we pass that judgment. Peer review of papers, of grant applications, of ethics applications are some of the institutionalised work practices where these problematic processes of judgment are made most explicit and where increasingly they fall over into the realm of the absurd. It would be great, for example, to have a vigorous debate and not just a lip service conversation about the increasing absurdities of risk-averse research ethics approval processes that primarily seek to ensure the neoliberal university against risk. What impacts do these processes have on methodological innovation, on engaging with the difficult challenges faced by those populations of young people condemned to the margins of the capitalist scene? So my aim here is not to so much banish or move beyond this absurdity. Rather, my interest lie in exploring the ways in which it is possible to reimagine, even re-enchant, the sociological imagination for the Anthropocene within these labour processes and work practices that continue to shape these institutionalised intellectual knowledge production processes. In the reading I included for this presentation, which was titled Breadth and the Truths of Youth at Risk, Allegory and the Social Scientific Imagination, I did some of this thinking. This is I think it was published in 2011 in the Journal of Youth Studies, and considered how a re-enchantment of a sociological imagination might be energised by knowledge practices such as allegory in genres other than academic writing. In that paper, I suggested that Tim Winton's 2008 novel Breath could be read as an allegorical tale about the terror of being ordinary, and of the teenage years as being a time in a life in which the fear of being ordinary compels Winton's key characters, Pikelet and his mate Looney, to seek out, but often stumble upon, that which promised to make theirs a life less ordinary. In Winton's novel, risk is something that breathes energy and purpose into Pikelet and Looney's lives in a remote coastal town in southwest Western Australia. Lives that are dominated by the institutionalised ordinariness of family, of being a certain type of man, of school and of work. At one point, in reflecting on his first encounter with surfing, Pikelet recalls, "I couldn't have put words to it as a boy, but later I understood what seized my imagination that day, how strange it was to see men doing something beautiful, something pointless and elegant, as though nobody saw or cared. In Sawyer, men did solid, practical things, mostly with their hands. There wasn't much room for beauty in the lives of our men." As a reviewer of Breath observed at that time, "Who would have thought that a novel about an extreme sport, surfing the wild swells off the coast of Australia, would be about nothing less than the infirm glory of the human condition and the damage left in the wake of tasting the limits set for our human frame? Tim Winton's Breath is as much a novel about surfing as The Old Man in the Sea is about fishing and Moby Dick about whale hunting." In that context, I was suggesting that there are multiple diverse ways in which we as humans can tell and read stories that may not be real, but which can be powerfully true. I close my discussion of the ways in which Breath could be read with what English critic James Wood suggests that we might find if we go looking for meaning and knowledge in practices other than the ones we're encouraged, even compelled to use in the practice of 21st century social science. Wood argues that the question of fiction's referentiality, does fiction make true statements about the world, is the wrong one, because fiction does not ask us to believe things in a philosophical sense, but to imagine them in an artistic sense. Here, imagining the heat of the sun on your back is about as different an activity as can be from believing that tomorrow it will be sunny. One experience is all but sensual, the other wholly abstract. This sense of imagination provides a means to move beyond the problematic arena of the real to a sometimes more problematic notion of truth. In this context, as we encounter a variety of texts, such as Breath, we can stumble upon what Wood calls the blue river of truth, the space in which we might engage scenes and moments and perfectly place words in fiction and poetry and film and drama, which strike us with their truth, which move and sustain us, and which shake habit's house to its foundation. So my work here and elsewhere has been informed by English sociologist John Law in his 2004 book After Method, Mess in Social Science Research, and I've included links to that in the document as well. After Method was published at a time in the UK when research methods had been mandated as a compulsory course for undergraduate courses that included a thesis to determine if you graduated with a first or second class degree. As the blurb for the book notes, research methods, a compulsory course which is loved by some but hated by many. This book is about what went wrong with research methods. Its controversial argument is radical, even revolutionary. Law's concerns included the narrow ways in which research methods were conceived, introduced and taught, often around problematic divisions such as qualitative or quantitative, objective, subjective. And in terms of a rigid rule-bound logic, in terms of rigid rule-bound logics and work practices that determines what is academic and what is not, what is data or evidence and what is not, what can be claimed to be true and what can't claim to be true. Law's concerns and interests mirror many of my own, teaching in undergraduate, honours, masters and PhD methodology courses, first at UQ, then at Deakin, then at Monash, then Deakin again, then in the UK, then at RMIT, and finally back here at Deakin again. And If you're on the mailing list for EDX 707 or 701 at this point in time, these debates are live. So over a number of years, Law has made a provocative contribution to ongoing discussions about what he and others such as Anne-Marie Moll, Bruno Latour, Donna Haraway and others understand as the knowledge practices that are deemed within different disciplinary boundaries as being appropriate for producing particular truth claims. As a methods book, After Method introduces a productive vocabulary for reimagining these knowledge practices. I don't have time to canvass a wide range of items in that vocabulary, but if you haven't read it, I'd recommend it for those interested in, imagining or reimagining research methods. So instead, in finishing up, I want to focus on what Law defines as method assemblage and how I have used this concept to try and reimagine the concepts of structure and agency in the doing of sociologies of young people in the context of profound transformation in Earth systems. Transformations that appear as being complex and entangled at the same time as they emerge as a consequence of human actions, but then appear to be beyond any individual or collective agency. Sociology at its most fundamental level is a child of a European Enlightenment cosmology that severed the social from the natural, the human from the animal, and created the sociological human as a rational, choice-making, autonomous, individualized agent of his own actions and destiny, and as the agent of human progress and perfectibility. In this context, orthodox sociologies of young people start from the idea of an individual, autonomous, sociological young person who is born into and is shaped by a pre-existing social world of relations, practices, and processes, what might be called structures. From this starting point, questions of structure and agencies, time and space, the social and the natural, establish and police the limits of thinking sociologically about young people's existence and their experiences of that existence. At the same time, often as a consequence of work done in fields such as physics, biology, and earth system science, the Anthropocene as discourse has signalled a re-emergence of an acknowledgement and understanding of the fundamental entanglement and interconnectedness of stuff, from the quantum scale through Earth systems to the forces driving the increasingly faster expansion of the universe. In this context, there is an increasing recognition, mostly in spaces other than orthodox youth sociologies, that so much of the stuff of the biosphere and the cosmos is indifferent to how I think and feel about some of the issues that might interest us and or confound us. My agency, for want of a better term, has no place, no meaningful presence in these spaces. In this sense, there is a challenge to continually consider the temporal and spatial scales that we are working with in thinking about past and presents and futures, and at what scale it might make sense to talk about and research young people's agency. Again, I think there's a whole lot to explore there, and certainly in the work I'm doing with my colleagues in the Young People's Sustainable Futures Lab, we're trying to think through some of these things as we know others are. But I want to come back finally to the idea of method assemblage and what it offers for thinking about those questions. In the way Law talks about it, method assemblage seeks to make explicit what he calls the crafting, bundling, or gathering of relations between what he identifies as in here or present, for instance, a representation or an object, between what is absent but also manifest, it can be seen, is described as manifestly relevant to what's made present, and finally between what is absent but is other, because while necessary to presence, it is also hidden, repressed, or uninteresting. For me, this idea of method assemblage signals an ongoing process of enacting sociological cosmologies that can be reconfigured to reimagine what sociologies of young people make present in constructing young people as sociological humans. In making these things present, what do sociologies of young people make manifestly absent? We can identify and acknowledge these things, but we choose to exclude them in order to make other things present. Those things that are made absent as other in sociologies of young people comprise those mechanisms, properties, and forces that are apparently unthinkable sociologically. For me, these are not just orthodox or narrowly defined questions of methodology or methods. They also relate to what law calls the ontological politics that shape the enactment of the problems we research, the sorts of goods we want to produce through these enactments, and the forms of representation that can be used to communicate the results of those enactments, to serve what he calls the goods that we seek to produce, goods such as truth or politics or aesthetics, justice or the spiritual. In the presents and futures we are bequeathing young people, these seem to be important things to consider and to continue to ask questions about in relation to whether the institutionalised intellectual knowledge practices of the neoliberal university are actually equipped to meet those challenges. To finish, I haven't even mentioned the challenges and the opportunities that machine intelligences pose now, 5 years from now, 20 years from now, for thinking about research as a process of knowledge production and for thinking about what we will mean by research methodologies at those times. But if you're interested in what I might have said, then these blogs might be a good starting point.